As Secretary Rubio stated just yesterday, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States.
The State Department put this out on social media today, saying this is our hemisphere. So you see that, I mean, that is not just our country, our self-interest, it is the whole geographic region of spanning multiple continents.
Yeah, but with great respect to the State Department, David, this is our hemisphere. I could put out a little thing on YouTube saying this is my hemisphere, this is our hemisphere. Like, what the hell is this? You can't unilaterally declare that you have unique jurisdiction over an entire half of the world, and all the people who live in that half of the world just have to put up or shut up. And that's not how the world works.
There's a sentence Washington keeps repeating, and it's not a warning. It's a property claim. This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. We will not allow adversaries here. Most people hear that and think it's about security. A normal statement. A responsible warning. But it's not. It's a declaration of ownership. That line turns geography into jurisdiction, and turns your sovereignty into something you have to earn. And Venezuela is the proof. Because once a superpower declares a region ours, every independent alliance becomes a threat, every resource policy becomes instability, and intervention becomes security. Venezuela is one of the countries trapped inside this worldview right now. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how a 200-year-old doctrine still governs Latin America, how the word adversary launders power into legitimacy, and why this isn't just Venezuela's story, but a blueprint the Global South needs to recognize. This is Liberation Lens. Let's break the script. Let's start with a simple truth. Empires don't always announce themselves as empires. Sometimes they call themselves security. Sometimes they call themselves stability. Sometimes they call themselves democracy. But when you strip away the vocabulary, what remains is a doctrine that still believes a hemisphere can be owned. That's not conspiracy. That's history. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine declared the Americas off limits to foreign powers. Back then the target was Europe. It sounded defensive. Even noble. A young republic warning old empires to stay out. But doctrines expand. They rarely stay in their original shape. What begins as Europe's stay out becomes we decide what happens here. Over time, the Monroe Doctrine evolved into a permission structure. Latin America could be sovereign, as long as that sovereignty didn't disrupt US strategic interests. And that is why the targets keep changing. Yesterday it was European empires. Later it was communism. Today it's adversaries, meaning China, Russia, Iran. Different vocabulary. Same logic. This is our hemisphere. A sentence that turns geography into jurisdiction. A sentence that transforms sovereignty into permission. Now here's the part many people miss. The Monroe Doctrine doesn't need to be formally declared every morning to operate. It becomes political instinct. Muscle memory. A reflex. So when a Latin American government makes moves that strengthen ties with rival powers, Washington doesn't interpret that as normal diplomacy. It interprets it as intrusion. As infiltration. As provocation. And Venezuela is a perfect case study because it combines two things empires obsess over. That's strategic location and strategic resources. So when Venezuela deepens ties with Russia, accepts Chinese financing, and works with Iran for fuel, technical support, and survival under sanctions, Washington doesn't see a sovereign country choosing partners. It sees defiance. And in a hemisphere claimed as a sphere of influence, defiance is treated as instability. Not because it causes chaos, but because it breaks control. Here's a line that sums up the entire mindset. We will not allow adversaries here. That word, adversary, does enormous political work. It turns sovereign states into intruders. It turns partnerships into infiltration. It turns Venezuela's choices into violations. And then it flips the moral story so cleanly that intervention becomes defense. Because if others are coming here, then Washington is simply protecting the hemisphere. That's the narrative trick. Power becomes security. Autonomy becomes danger. And once the story is flipped, the policy menu becomes easier to sell. Sanctions become pressure. Economic strangulation becomes accountability. Asset seizures become enforcement. Diplomatic isolation becomes standing up for democracy. Regime change becomes helping the people. This is not just foreign policy. It's linguistic alchemy, where influence is laundered into the language of protection. Now, some viewers might ask, okay, but isn't the US reacting to real threats? Here's the Liberation Lens answer. Every great power claims it is reacting. That's how great power hides initiative. The real question is not whether threats exist. The real question is, who gets to define the threat? Because if Venezuela trading with Iran is framed as a hemispheric threat, then the definition of threat is not about missiles. It's about control. And that's why autonomy becomes criminalized. Not always through courts. Through consequences. Let's make this concrete. When the US recognized an alternative government in Venezuela, that wasn't only moral posturing. It was a strategic move. It was a way of saying, we reserve the right to decide legitimacy in your country. That is power in its rawest form, the power to declare who is real and who is not. When sweeping sanctions were imposed, that wasn't only punishment of leadership. It was a squeeze on the state's ability to function. On oil revenue. On trade. On financial access. On the oxygen of everyday economic life. And when Maduro was framed as illegitimate, that wasn't just commentary. That was narrative preparation. Because once a leader is treated as illegitimate, harsher measures feel normal. This is how the script works. First, delegitimize. Second, isolate. Third, choke economic pathways. Fourth, present intervention as the solution to the chaos your pressure helped create. And notice how cleanly it fits inside the doctrine. If the hemisphere is yours, then correcting a country becomes a managerial task. Not war. Not imperialism. Management. Now zoom out, because Venezuela is not the beginning of this story. It's a continuation. Whenever Latin American governments have stepped outside US influence, the same underlying permission structure reasserts itself. Guatemala, 1954. Chile, 1973. Grenada, 1983. Panama, 1989. Haiti, 2004. Different decades. Different excuses. Same pattern. The actors change. The rhetoric modernizes. But the foundational claim remains unchanged, this is our hemisphere. And here is the part mainstream analysis often avoids. This is not only about ideology. It's about alignment. About who gets military cooperation in the region. About who gets ports and infrastructure. About who gets investment deals and mineral contracts. About who gets energy influence. Because when Venezuela opens space for Russian cooperation, Chinese financing, or Iranian support, Washington sees not just Venezuela making friends. It sees the hemisphere becoming multipolar. And multipolarity is the enemy of a sphere of influence. So the project to remove Maduro was never just a domestic Venezuelan issue. It was a geopolitical project, an attempt to enforce hemispheric alignment. That's why Liberation Lens insists we ask questions that cut through the vocabulary. Who decides what the hemisphere is? Who decides who belongs? Who decides which partnerships are legitimate? Who decides which governments are acceptable? Because when a superpower says we will not allow adversaries here, it is not describing reality. It is constructing it. It is drawing borders that do not appear on maps. Borders of acceptable politics. Borders of acceptable alliances. Borders of acceptable sovereignty. And when those borders are crossed, the system reacts. Sometimes with invasion. More often today with pressure. Sanctions. Seizures. Financial isolation. Diplomatic warfare. Recognition games. This is why you can't treat Venezuela as a single-issue story. Venezuela is a lesson in how sovereignty is managed in an empire-shaped world. Now let's make the Global South connection explicit, because this is where Liberation Lens earns its name. If you're watching from Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, or the Caribbean, this is not a distant history lesson. This is a mirror. The mechanism is the same everywhere power and resources intersect. First, your alliances are judged. Then your policies are labeled. Then pressure arrives, financial, diplomatic, economic. And if you resist, the story you hear on the news will change. Not because reality changed, but because framing changed. One day you're a government. The next day you're a regime. One day you're independent. The next day you're destabilizing. One day you're trading. The next day you're enabling adversaries. This is how sovereignty becomes conditional. Not in the Constitution. In practice. It becomes a lease, not a right. Renewal only as long as your resources align, your alliances remain convenient, and your choices don't challenge established hierarchies. Now, some people will say, but Latin America is different. The Monroe Doctrine is unique to the Americas. Here's the deeper truth. The Monroe Doctrine is a regional brand name for a global phenomenon, spheres of influence. In Africa it appears through resource extraction agreements, military bases, and debt leverage. In Asia it appears through containment strategies, alliance blocks, and maritime choke points. In the Middle East it appears through energy corridors, sanctions architecture, and security patronage. So the lesson of Venezuela is bigger than Venezuela. It's about the rules that are claimed versus the rules that are applied. It's about who gets sovereignty by right, and who gets it only by permission. Now let's return to the opening sentence, because it's the key. This is the Western Hemisphere. We will not allow adversaries here. That statement is not a warning. It's a map of hierarchy. It announces who speaks as owner. It announces who is allowed to decide. And it announces who is expected to comply. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because suddenly, US policy in Venezuela stops looking like a collection of separate actions. Sanctions. Recognition. diplomatic pressure, economic isolation, narrative warfare. They become one coherent thing. A doctrine enforcing alignment. A sphere maintaining itself. An empire managing its domain. So the real question is not whether Venezuela's government is perfect. That's not the point. The real question is, who gave any external power the authority to treat the hemisphere like property? Because the Western Hemisphere is not a possession. It is not a backyard. It is not a sphere to be managed. It is a region of sovereign nations. And every time a country chooses a path that challenges established hierarchies, the same unresolved tension returns. Who truly gets to decide the future of the Americas? And if you're watching from the global south, this question is not rhetorical. It's existential. Because the same script, different accents, plays everywhere power and resources intersect. So here's the call to action. Drop a comment and tell us where you see this doctrine at work in your region. Not only in Latin America. Anywhere. Name the vocabulary that shows up in your country: stability, security, adversaries, rules-based order. And tell us what it is used to justify. Because the first step out of dependency is recognizing the language of control. At Liberation Lens, we don't just report the news. We translate the script of power. If this breakdown sharpened your perspective, subscribe, share, and stay with us, because the doctrine behind Venezuela is not finished. It's being updated in real time. This is Liberation Lens. And in a world of curated language, perspective has never mattered more. I'll see you in the next.